All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I see that our participant numbers keeps increasing, so we'll probably have a few more joining here as we get started. It's a couple minutes after 12 here in Indiana, and so I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on building your brand, mentoring for entrepreneurial activities. I'm Neil Knobloch, and I'm a professor here at Purdue University, and I'm a co-director of the Mentoring at Purdue program with my colleague, Dr. Levon Esters, who is also on this Zoom session. And it's my opportunity to also realize that we cannot do these webinars and activities without the support of an excellent team of graduate students. And so I just want to do a shout out to Stephen McBride. Thank you for organizing the webinar. Also to Cornell Francis, Andreas Zavala, Ryan Cornegay, and Zachary Brown, and many of our MAP alumnus who also may be joining us on this Zoom. So it's my pleasure to facilitate today's webinar, and this is an exciting topic. As I reflect on my own experiences of getting a PhD, how many times did I hear, what do you want to become? Or what is your story? What impact do you want to have? And a number of those questions I didn't realize were really pushing me to think with an entrepreneurial mindset, or to think more in an entrepreneurial way. Some of that may be a very different journey for all of us, but today our panel will bring diverse perspectives on what this may look and sound like in their own journeys, as well as in mentoring graduate students and how they may be developing entrepreneurship on their journey and building their own brand. I'd like to start first with just a couple logistics. I'm sure most of you are on mute, and that would be great to minimize feedback. And if you do want to ask a question later in today's webinar, you can unmute and do so. We'll also be monitoring chat. Feel free to add any comments that resonates with you that you hear, or ask questions in chat. And a couple of our grad students will be monitoring the chat to also make sure we don't miss any of those questions. We'll have a panel of 4 colleagues briefly introduce themselves to get started here. And then I'll facilitate with about 30 minutes of questions that the Mentoring at Purdue team developed. And we've shared those ahead of time so that our panelists have had a chance to kind of think through some of their ideas. And then we'll open it up for about 10 to 15 minutes of questions at the end. And that's where we'll address those that are in the chat, or anybody who wants to unmute at that time can do so. We'll also post a link of a brief survey. It may take 1 or 2, no more than 2 minutes to complete. And please do this so that we get your feedback and we continue to offer topics that are relevant and useful going into the fall and for the next academic year. So without any further delay, I'm going to just walk through the panel and ask them to introduce themselves. You can share a little bit about what you currently do. And then one of our questions was, if you would like to share any personal experiences about entrepreneurship, feel free to do that in your introduction as well. So I guess I'll just start with in alphabetical order. So Lisa, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. So good afternoon. My name is Lisa Bosman. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Technology, Leadership, and Innovation within the Purdue Polytechnic Institute at Purdue University. From my background, educational, my degrees are all the way through the PhD and include both engineering and management. Prior to joining academia, I worked in industry as a manufacturing engineer for Harley-Davidson, John Deere, and Oshkosh Defense. Here at Purdue, I'm the founding director of I Agree Labs, which stands for Inclusive, Applied, and Grounded Research in Entrepreneurially Minded Research. In 2018, I published the text Teaching the Entrepreneurial Mindset to Engineers. It was so well received that the publisher reached out about a second text. And so by the end of this summer, a next text will be available, teaching the entrepreneurial mindset across the university and integrative approach. And then just some background on my personal experience with entrepreneurship. I currently have 2 legally established companies. Solar Swami is a technology company aimed at real-time monitoring and preventative maintenance for solar energy systems, and STEM Empowerment Professionals, which is an education consulting business. And over the past 5 or 6 years, I've participated in several accelerator startup programs, led an NSF I-Core Teams Award, and participated in Purdue's Entrepreneurship Leadership Academy for faculty.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Appreciate the introduction. Next, we'll go to Nathalie.
Nathalie, you're muted.
Thank you, Lisa. So I'm Nathalie Duval-Couetil, and I'm a professor in the Department of Technology, Leadership, and Innovation. And I also have a couple of other roles on campus. I'm the director of the Certificate in Entrepreneurship and Innovation program and associate director of the Entrepreneurship Center. My background, after my MBA, I went and worked in management consulting in Europe for Booz Allen and Hamilton, then worked for another kind of business development consulting firm in Boston called Data and Strategies Group. Also worked for a brand strategy and design firm for a very short time prior to leaving Europe. My experience with entrepreneurship is my parents had a mountaineering equipment basement that they company that they ran out of our basement when I was a kid, in addition to my father's full-time job. And then I worked in the 128 Entrepreneur Center in Boston for a couple of years while I was a student. And now I help my husband, who has a startup, and he's a professor here, as well as my son. So it's a family affair. And I do research on entrepreneurship education. I'm a co-PI on our I-Core grant here, responsible for the research and evaluation on that grant. I think that's enough.
All right. Yeah, and thank you, Nathalie. And I'm going to just go ahead and use first names throughout this panel today, just to keep it informal. Next, we'll go to Ariel.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Ariel Smith. I am a PhD candidate in American Studies, and I wear quite a few hats on campus. So I am the scholar in resident for the Black Cultural Center, for the Black Thought Collective there. I'm also an instructor for both American Studies and African American Studies, where I have designed courses in entrepreneurship in both departments. And that's one of the classes I was leaving early today, was my Black entrepreneurship course. In terms of education, so my bachelor's degree is actually in business management with a concentration in HR. I have a master's degree in education, and now we're here at Purdue. In terms of certificates, I've been around to quite a few business schools. So I did get one from Krannert as part of their Applied Management Principal Certificate program last summer. I've also done certificate programs in financial accounting for the University of Alabama, as well as the Government Economic Institute at Auburn University. In terms of entrepreneurship, most people know me for the Food Truck Scholar. That is actually my second company. I've done everything from consulting to youth motivational speaking, but the Food Truck Scholar is probably my baby and what many people in the audience are familiar with. Thank you so much, Dr. Esters. The podcast launched in 2019, the brand itself in 2018. We're in 71 countries worldwide. We've been featured by Yahoo, NPR, and many other great places. We're in the process of releasing a book and an app this year as well. We've partnered with Grow with Google and many other places. So very happy to be a part of that. Also have done a lot with young adults when it comes down to entrepreneurship. So I've done a lot of youth participatory action research, first at my alma mater at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. We've also continued that on at Vanderbilt University and here at Purdue. Part of that comes through the courses I teach, but also comes through summer programs that I've helped co-design with the Purdue Black Cultural Center each summer, with the exception of last summer, of course, because we was all in the pandemic. But I'm also looking forward to doing some work in Kentucky this year as well.
Thank you, Ariel. I really appreciate that introduction. And last but not least, Don Stanley.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much. What an incredible group of people. Wow, I'm humbled and honored to be a part of this. I teach at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, some digital marketing courses. My background is I was working on my master's degree and fell into the opportunity to create my own consulting business. I went to what are considered inner city schools in Milwaukee, didn't grow up around any entrepreneurship. I'm a first generation college student. And so I learned a lot on the fly. And one of my passions is helping young people have the opportunity to see what's available to them, especially young people who don't traditionally get exposed to these opportunities. So I've been lucky to have incredible mentors, teachers on my path. And so I try to pass that on. Been lucky enough to consult with all kinds of organizations, all the way from NFL and NBA athletes, a Nobel Prize winner, UN ambassador, worked with Starbucks. One of my recent organizations that I work for with an accelerator here in Madison just became a unicorn company. So got $1 billion valuation, which was really awesome. And then my biggest passion really is helping students from different backgrounds learn how they can start to build their own profiles while they are in school, to discover themselves, but also start creating a pathway for them to have opportunities where they can use their skills, their talents, their passions to drive economic change for themselves and others. So grateful to be here.
All right, and thank you, Don, for sharing that introduction. So we're just going to roll right into the questions here. And the first question is going to focus on graduate students. What different ways should graduate students think about entrepreneurship, and how can they develop entrepreneurship skills? Any thoughts? And anybody can go first in the panel, and let's roll.
I can take a start here in responding to this. So a term that I like to use is entrepreneurial mindset versus entrepreneurship, just because there's a tendency for people to assume entrepreneurship is limited to startups. And so focusing on the mindset encourages grad students to think about the bigger picture and how it might impact other areas of their life. So in one of the books that I previously mentioned, we define the entrepreneurial mindset as the inclination to discover, evaluate, and exploit opportunities. So given this focus, the concept of entrepreneurship can be perceived as more of an umbrella term that can lead people to think more strategically about the value they offer and actions taken in multiple settings. So perhaps that could be a startup, but it also could be working within an organization, an academic organization, industry organization, or even government organization. And in that case, grad students could play a role perhaps in new product development, or even implementing a continuous improvement project, maybe using like Kaizen processes and other lean tools through the Toyota production system. But it can also apply in one's personal life. So this concept of an entrepreneurial mindset, always thinking about the discovery, evaluation, and exploiting of opportunities. So even in one's personal life, it could be something as simple as shopping around for car insurance. So I just like to think about entrepreneurship more from that perspective of a mindset versus the traditional concept of a startup.
And I would
add, sorry.
Oh, if I may.
Yeah.
I just wanted to chime in and say, Lisa, I do agree that oftentimes startups is seen as the only form of entrepreneurship. And so I definitely wanted to push on that point. I actually push against that notion in my classroom because most of your entrepreneurs are outside of the startups. They're your hairstylists, there are your yoga instructors, they're in theater. So I want them to see themselves both with an entrepreneurial mindset, but also positioned within entrepreneurship. And so my main goal is thinking about problem solving. At the end of the day, entrepreneurship is about problem solving and about leveraging your resources. So right now, the final project that my students are doing right now is they have the option to either do a business model canvas or a personal business model canvas. Essentially, they figure out who do they want to help or what issue do they want to address. How are they going to go about doing that? What resources do they already have to leverage that? What is it going to cost them and what do they expect to gain? I would be remiss if we don't just start out with just saying most graduate students, well, all graduate students are going to complete some type of thesis, whether it's a master's degree or a PhD that addresses a question or almost a problem, if you will. Getting them to understand that that research question is not just something for the academy. It can also be used outside of the academy as well. So I think to answer your question, Neil, is that we first have to embrace the fact and encourage students to understand that this question that you are addressing in academia can also be answered in other places, and push them to think about where can we start applying the research that you're doing in that space.
Oh, this is good stuff. Let's keep it rolling. Nathalie, I think you're next.
Yeah, I think of it, especially at the grad student level, really as a form of professional development, because it can help just so many aspects of your personal, professional development and, your dissertation research and even your job, your job search, for instance. And it really goes far beyond it. It is mindset. It's a way of looking at things. It's problem solving. It's also business literacy, which can be very useful. Just gaining that language, if you're interviewing, can be very useful to students. It's also a way to communicate. It's a way to communicate kind of in a non-scientific way, which is, a great way to describe the value of what you're doing to a larger population of people. And I would recommend to students, you can take a course, just to get that business literacy. Ariel, your course sounds fabulous. We do some similar things in some of the entrepreneurship courses. At the grad level in the fall, we offer this course, Life of a Faculty Entrepreneur, Discovery, Development, Translation. You don't need to have an idea for that course. The whole purpose is to get you that literacy so you can participate in kind of more advanced, more hands-on things like I-Core and things like that. I know graduate students are in very different situations with their advisors. Some allow them to kind of go out and do different things and encourage them to do that. Other people want them in the lab just working on the research. We've done focus groups with many students here. And it's very variable. So I would say, talk to your advisor if they're reluctant to have you take courses outside, and get them to understand what the potential value might be.
Yeah, and I add in great information, and love the idea too that there's courses like this that exist that didn't exist in the past to encourage this entrepreneurship. For me, not having any background in entrepreneurship, not knowing anybody who owned a business, I just started researching companies and businesses and organizations that I thought were really cool, doing things I liked, were creating some change. And I just asked the people if I could talk to them who started it. If they're not available, this was pre-social media, just going and reading books from entrepreneurs. And I think one of the big things that's been hit on here is that there's a wide definition of what entrepreneurial mindset is and how you can execute it. It doesn't have to be, I'm going all in and devoting my life full time to a startup. I love being at the university, so I have a consultancy on the side. So you can have so many different options today that weren't available 10, 15, 20 years ago, that you can make it what you want. But I think the biggest thing is identifying a problem and saying, hey, I think I can add to helping solve this, and then seeing if you can pursue it. What I use with my students is I say, is there a need? Are you passionate about it? Do you have the skills for it? And is there an economic need for it? And so it's Ikigai, which is a Japanese model. And it's really that simple. It does not need to be complicated. And I have found with a lot of my students that I've done this with, I've literally had students break down in tears at the end of the semester, in particular graduate and PhD students who are like, you gave me hope. You let me see another opportunity that I didn't know existed. And I'm like, I just showed you the door, but you've got the drive to do it now, go for it. And I think that's an important thing, is find what makes you tick. And whether that's in a business, doing a little side hustle, in academia, in a combination of all, there's always going to be a great opportunity to do your best work.
Excellent. And I really appreciate the robust perspectives here and different perspectives. So as we now transition to the conversation that faculty can have with graduate students and that mentoring relationship, what does that look like? How can mentors help facilitate graduate students to engage in entrepreneurial thinking or mindset activities? And it's pretty open. You can take this a lot of different directions. So anybody on the panel want to start with this one?
What I personally do is I actually encourage all of my students, undergraduate and graduate students, to come and meet with me. And we basically just have a kind of a conversation about going through what I had just mentioned. What are you good at? What are you passionate about? What are the opportunities potentially economically for you? And thinking about that. And really, there's not a lot of introspective work that's encouraged from K through 12 and then even in higher academics, unfortunately. And I think just starting there and really starting them with a sense of, you have to be cognizant of your product to be able to promote that product or service. And the product or service in this case is you. So finding out what makes you tick, what helps you get excited, where you've got the ability to find opportunity. What I have found in doing this for 20 years with a class like this is that a lot of times that opens students up to opportunities and multiple paths that they can explore, rather than saying, pick one path, go for it. And if this path doesn't work for you, a lot of students will be discouraged and feel like, well, I wasn't meant to be an entrepreneur. It's like, no, find out again who you are first, where those opportunities could lie, and then look for ways to implement those.
Yeah, as I said, getting your advisor to encourage you, or you just do it yourself, to participate in workshops and activities or courses is valuable. It depends on what your research is. What Don was saying, lends itself to certain types of research, but I know many students who are working in labs are completely overwhelmed with that lab kind of work. But if there are commercial opportunities associated with that research, is maybe talking to your advisor about participating in their kind of short courses of I-Corps that are available on campus. I also think that just any industry engagement, if you look at the research, if students are accustomed to working with industry, so if your advisor has relationships to industry, to try to get talking to people in positions you might be interested in, or maybe do an externship, for a month or two in a company. Those are experiences that we know help people become entrepreneurs. So if you have any interest in that, sometimes we think that our educational programs aren't flexible, but it's because we don't ask for much while we're going through them. So if there is something that you're really passionate about, ask about it. I was talking to a grad student yesterday who was saying that he was advised to look at somebody in a position that you want to be in, go talk to them, and then reverse engineer that career and see what you need to do to get there, which I thought was great advice.
There's often three things I focus on when mentoring my students specific to branding. I often tell students to take inventory of how they spend their time. So how we spend our time, either as faculty or grad students, should be related to a value proposition, including a customer or stakeholder and the value we can bring to that customer or stakeholder. So, but also that value proposition, it doesn't necessarily have to be what's offered to others. Although I do encourage students to ask themselves, will completing this task add to my resume or CV? But it could also be to, will it add and develop me as a personal and professional development, or develop me personally? I also encourage students to update their resume or CV regularly instead of waiting until it's requested for an application or some other reason. And so this just ensures that everything will be documented. And it also encourages students to think about how they spend their time and if there is an outcome that will be relevant to how they portray their value. And then finally, I encourage students to just be consistent when communicating their brand or their image across multiple social media sites, such as LinkedIn or Twitter, or even a personal website, just to make sure that there's consistency in what that message is.
I echo the points my colleagues have made, especially on consistency and being clear on what you want to do. One of the things that I think that is challenging sometimes for us, and sometimes the hesitancy, Lisa, with updating that resume, is sometimes figuring out where in the world does some of our expertise go. Because so a lot of times we have mentors that aren't necessarily entrepreneurial. And so when we're looking at their CVs, we don't really know where the work that we do that they don't really do, where does that fit? So if there's ever an opportunity for that type of webinar workshop, I want in. But one of my points that I do want to bring up about what students can do is remember, entrepreneurship takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of dedication. So while I do agree that, think about ways it can be on your resume and your own personal development, it's also okay for that entrepreneurial endeavor to not be tied to your research. It is totally okay for that research and your entrepreneurship to stand alone. They don't always have to coincide. Maybe this is the opportunity where you realize I'm actually very passionate about this and about this thing. And when I work on it, it actually keeps me focused and balanced to go back to my dissertation. I didn't necessarily start the Food Truck Scholar so that it could become a part of my research, but the Food Truck Scholar definitely kept me accountable and made me want to finish my PhD. So I also want to say, while I echo everything that other colleagues and panelists have said, I definitely want to encourage students to understand that their entrepreneurial endeavors can exist within and beyond the academy, that they're not committed to just what their research says.
Yeah, excellent advice. Really appreciate these comments. I'm going to press in a little bit more on the comment that was made. I think, Lisa, you said be consistent when communicating your brand. And Ariel, you said that's very important. Graduate students are learning a whole new set of vocabulary and are being pushed to be more specific, more technical. But how do you coach somebody to find the right words, to find the branding and the messaging as they sort out, okay, this is who I am and how I want to project myself?
My advice would be to drop the jargon. Too many times we're too committed to whatever our discipline says we should sound like. I'm not too committed on what American Studies scholars should sound like. And if I sound like it, I do it. And if I don't, I don't. But ultimately, I want my 95-year-old great grandmother to understand what I do. And as long as she understands it, and as long as the people that I write in conversation to understand what I'm doing, then that's important. So my work is around food trucks. I don't think that I would be doing my job as an entrepreneur or as a scholar if I position my brand or my research in a way that's not accessible to them. So when we're talking about language and we're talking about branding, your stakeholder has to be central to that. What is the language that they speak with? How can you incorporate and embody that type of language to make sure that, hey, I'm not just talking about you or I'm talking to you, I'm talking with you.
I'll piggyback off that. One of the quotes that I use in all of my classes is it's as though you're talking to somebody else, and it's, if you wish to persuade me, you must think my thoughts, you must feel my feelings, and you must speak my words. And really what that is about empathy. And I'll often ask my students, is that good sound advice for life? Or in my workshops, is that good sound advice for life? Think like the other person, try to feel like them as much as you can and try to understand them as much as you can. And the quote, the person, and then I'll also ask who said that quote. And the answer is Cicero. And the idea is this isn't new, thinking and being cognizant of your audience, whether it's in one-on-one communication, presenting to a group, starting a business, really comes to thinking about how can I best connect with that person? I often call it data-driven empathy, looking at content that helps build those connections. And I think that is a huge key, is thinking about when you're communicating that there's a human on the other end of whatever you're posting, whether it's a website, social media channel, and am I being helpful to them? That's I think a mindset that really helps, especially when you might not be getting a lot of interaction right away and you're starting out, is just thinking about helping that one person. And that's a lot of times what helps people get that momentum to start going and then keep going as they build whatever it is that they're building.
Just to follow up off of what Ariel said, which was the more nuanced or detailed, which I greatly agree with, is, removing the jargon. Another perspective, more a high level perspective, is just to be consistent in that if on LinkedIn you say you work for an employer and on Twitter you say you have your own company, that can be confusing. So setting even jargon or language aside, it's being consistent in both of those ways. And it's also important to keep in mind that for students, faculty, or anybody out there that might have a job as an employer and who has a desire to have a side job as a business to potentially grow, sometimes employers aren't okay with that. And so it's just knowing that in advance. And in some cases, then you might have to create a website that may not include your name, or may have a Twitter that does not include your name if your employer might be against that. Even though there's plenty of research that shows when people do have side jobs, it benefits the company as a whole, but sometimes employers aren't on board with that. And so that's just something else I encourage students to keep in mind, knowing who your employer is, or like as a grad student, who your supervisor is, making sure that they're okay with you having this side business. And if they're not, that's something to consider about where you want to be currently and where you're going in the future.
Yeah, and I don't think, you have to have this all figured out while you're a grad student either. It's great if you do and to manage it. But, this could manifest in 10 years or something. So don't feel even more pressure to have to do it now. But one thing also that I tell students when they're interviewing or anything is people can't remember that much when you're talking to them or communicating. So what are really the 3 things that you want people to leave with in an interview? What it's something about what you did, or your what your goals are, but really succinctly think about 3 things and keep repeating those messages throughout an interview or throughout a conversation.
All right. Thank you. Excellent advice and thinking about building your own personal brand. I'd like to transition now to kind of environment, and how has the virtual environment created challenges or maybe opportunities to maybe develop some entrepreneurial mindset or start thinking about entrepreneurial activities. And if you also want to kind of speak to other opportunities beyond academia that exist, that's fine as well.
One of the things I've noticed quite a bit over the last year is there's an increased access to opportunities, where in the past, when it came to these accelerator startup programs, or even through MIT has the Blueprint program or comparable programs in the past, we've thought of these as best to be done in person. And although I still agree with that, the fact is that limits access to people. And so one of the things that I've encouraged my students to do, whether I see seminars or webinars or these accelerator startup programs, take advantage of them now while you can, because who knows after the pandemic if these will still be offered in a virtual environment.
Yeah, and I think your access to people is incredible right now, right? Everybody's sitting at their computers. So like I said, if there's somebody whose career that you're really interested in emulating, reach out to people. Typically, they're pretty responsive. So yeah, use the access.
We're definitely seeing a lot of that. So as a podcaster, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the growth for podcasts. Most definitely since 2014 with the advent of Serial, but we're definitely seeing it right now. And we're seeing a lot of different ways that that's even being leveraged. So Apple just announced that there's going to be different ways for you to do different paid tiers as a podcast creator. Also, we got to talk about Clubhouse. So Clubhouse has become another avenue. So sorry to all my Android users, but for those who are on iOS, it has been an amazing opportunity for many entrepreneurs to connect, collaborate, and also gain information. That's also a platform that has released monetization practices, especially to different creators. So for example, I now have a club on Clubhouse. It's the largest food truck club there. So now I have access to different ways that we can monetize. There's also a growth in apps that's being developed right now. One of our partners is helping you find Black-owned food trucks and restaurants. So there's a lot that's happening in tech. There's a lot that's happening in consulting. There's a lot that's happening with different books. I would not be surprised if we see more and more books come out in 2021. Just to give you a quick tangible examples. Yes, I see Dr. S is a proud Droid user. That's okay. You just can't get in the Clubhouse just yet. One of those examples, we're starting to see an emergence of coloring books, logs, like daily logs, different journals. A lot is happening on KDP with Amazon when it comes down to creating these forms of what you will consider like low stress forms of entrepreneurship and products right now.
And as a proud Android user, I've got to back Dr. Esther, sir. Sorry. But
thank you.
I got your back. And I think thinking about this, I do this a lot with consulting companies that I work with. I consult companies all over the world. And a year ago, I would be pressing them and saying, why aren't you thinking about turning more of your sales and interactions and connections to video? And they're like, no, we don't do that in our industry. Video calls don't work. Well, guess what? Now Zoom is everywhere. So I think about what I teach my students is to explore methods of sharing messages and connecting that work for you. And one quick example is I had a student in my class who's a dietitian who's now working on her master's in dietetics. And she wanted to use Instagram to talk about being a young woman and having dealt with food and eating disorder issues. And she had I think she has like 500 or 600 followers on Instagram, and she wanted to scale it. And I said, keep playing, Monica, with different platforms. Well, she found that she really is enjoys making TikTok videos, and she has 161,000 followers now on TikTok. One of her videos just got 1.7 million views, and virtually every top dietitian in the field that talks about healthy food relationships is now sharing her content and interacting with her. So the idea is that you can make these connections, as been said, and Nathalie was saying it, the accessibility of people to you is something that is unprecedented in many ways. So I've got a lot of tactics and strategies for that, but just thinking about that, finding what it is that you want to do. And now Monica, who's working on her master's degree, has a whole bunch of job opportunities when she graduates that weren't there 6 months to a year ago.
Right. Excellent. I really appreciate the engagement and ideas of this panel. I'm going to ask one more question and really cueing in those who have been listening and watching to get ready to ask your questions next. So my last question gets pretty specific. What are some books or other sources of information that you would say you definitely need to go check out if you were to encourage somebody to develop their brand or to pursue some entrepreneurial activities?
I think part of the brand development is so much related to access to technology or incorporation of technology that, at least to the best of my knowledge, I haven't seen any books out there, just because they can kind of be delayed as technology is constantly moving forward. So one thing I would recommend for students is to do a Google search or even use something like medium.com. And I saw Ariel posted something from Medium at the beginning. So medium.com is just a portal for writers. And even that's another way to become an entrepreneur, is to write, for medium.com and make money that way. but that's one of the places I know that has a good set of articles related to one's own personal brand. And the other thing I would just recommend, just a basic Google search to see what's available more recently versus a book that can kind of be outdated by the time it comes forward.
So there are tons of entrepreneurship books out there. I mean, it's crazy, every flavor of entrepreneurship. And some of them I don't like too much because I think they propagate a lot of stereotypes of entrepreneurs. But so a book that's totally different, but will help you anyway, is the book Essentialism, which is just about, you know, if you're a high performer, especially, you just get involved in so many things and you think you have to do so many things. And this book makes you reflect on what things should I be focusing on that I'll get a return on, or what are those things that I like, or how do people perceive me given the choices I'm making and how many choices I'm making. So I think that can be very helpful perspective for students.
I would say go to trade shows. In academia, we'll say conferences or summits, but in your respective field outside the academy, you'll probably say trade shows. That's something that I learned. So as a podcaster, I don't necessarily read books on podcasts, but I will go to PodFest Masterclass, where you got some of the best people around the world teaching me the ins and outs of podcasting. Now, there are some amazing books, and I definitely echo Essentialism. There was one book I had planned to mention, but I can't remember right now. But I do remember chapter 2 of Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, about being very specific about what it is that you want, making sure that that goal is tangible, realistic, and putting it into your head each and every day. So I think that's very important as well.
Yeah, that's a fantastic book recommendations. What I like to do is I like to tell people echoing part of what Lisa said, which is do a Google search. You're going to find podcasts, you're going to find vidcasts, you're going to find books, you're going to find blogs, whatever speaks to you. I learn best by hearing. So podcasts and videocasts, impact theory is one that I like, and it doesn't necessarily teach specifics of entrepreneurship. What it does rather is teach you about people who become entrepreneurs and how they think, and to reverse engineer, like Nathalie was saying earlier, and look for what are the commonalities of these people? What are the things that they did? What I love doing too is you identify a lot of people by doing that who didn't have these perfect starts. They didn't have these huge advantages, but they found ways. And for me, that's always been really helpful when I was like, oh, I wish I would have known somebody who had a business. And it's like, well, okay, there's a lot of people who started businesses who didn't have somebody in the, okay, so what can I do? And I think that can be a way where it really, really helps. For me, a book that I like is Tiny Habits. And it's not necessarily about entrepreneurship, but it's about, if you want to be a great entrepreneur, it's developing the mindset and habits. And really, what can you do better? And how can you pay attention to the little opportunities for you to become the best version of yourself, which then allows you, in my opinion, to be, you know, a great entrepreneur or whatever it is that you want to do.
All right. Really appreciate that roundabout on the question of continued learning. I did receive a question here in the chat that was just PM to me, but the question is this: can you share some tips for initiating your brand across social media sites? Also, any ideas for funding your idea? Can you share some tips for initiating your brand across social media sites and any ideas about funding your idea?
The number one thing I recommend, because my experience is a lot of times people in academia, at least graduate students and PhD students, tend to be a bit shy and humble about talking about themselves, or don't know what to say, don't know what to consistently share. What I recommend is doing research, identifying podcasts, books, authors, thought leaders that you really like, and then start using your channel to promote their stuff. So for example, 5 things I learned about Tiny Habits as a graduate student and why you should read it. And then what I'm going to do when I give my little blog post and then social media shares is I'm going to tag the authors. I'm going to tag people who are in the community. I've had incredible success stories with students getting literally international publicity in their fields during the semester. So looking for opportunities to share what you know, share who you think are thought leaders to follow. And when you do that, those thought leaders, those people who you look up to often will recognize you in some way and start to see that you're following and engaging with their content and promoting them. And I have yet to have somebody say, you know, could you please stop talking about how helpful my work is, because I don't want to hear it anymore. You know, what they do instead is they say thank you, and they start building an interaction, and you start building a network of people that again, I've got crazy cool success stories with that. And it's a simple, easy way to get started.
Some methods that I've used for the second question, referring to the funding, I think one of the most easy and basic things is through Purdue. I think it's still being offered, the NSF I-Course site program, and Nathalie might be able to speak more to that. I believe she's part of the leadership team for that. But with that, it's just a 5-week program aimed at customer discovery, whereby the teams get around $2,000 to do that customer discovery. So although that doesn't necessarily go towards prototype development or something like that, it can at least be used to validate that the product is needed. As another funding opportunity, a next level up from that would be the NSF I-Core Teams, which is a bigger pocket of funds, $50,000. And so this is one where I encourage grad students to collaborate. They need to have a faculty advisor, but then the grad student can get that training. And so that's $50,000, and that can be used for, again, for customer discovery. And then about $5,000 can be used for prototyping. And if participating in that, then they next encourage the NSF PFI, you know, going through the academic way of getting at funding. But then there's also many accelerator startup programs. And right now, especially, they're allowing students to do those from virtually. And so the time is now, I think, to really go after those accelerator startup programs, because after the pandemic, I don't anticipate those to stay as virtual options, just because they strongly encourage the, you know, getting out of the building and that face-to-face interaction for the customer discovery. So those are just some examples on the funding side.
Yeah, so I-Core is a good option if you're working on a Purdue-related technology. For the most part, they're trying to get that to be focused on getting intellectual property out of the university with that. But I agree with Lisa. There are also different competitions, not just accelerator programs, that if you have a good idea and you can put together a plan or a pitch, where you can get some money as well. And Purdue has competitions. So kind of stay tuned and start paying attention to some of the announcements on those competitions that can happen throughout the year that may be very topical.
Very briefly, I just wanted to say just a couple of things beyond Purdue, because I don't have my funding come from Purdue, and I get I have a little concern sometimes about that. So I'm thinking about it. But getting creative. So in regards to the social media, I just got out there. I didn't, read a formula or a book or anything like that. I created my social media pages, and I went with it just by introducing myself and, saying who I am and why I'm in this space. I think people just want you to not only have social media, but they want you to be in community with them. So the more they know about you and why you're in this space and why you're doing what you do, and you're consistent with that, to Lisa's point earlier, I think that goes a long way with building social media. With regards to funding, that's also an opportunity for you to get a little bit innovative. So absolutely, I would tell you to capitalize and seize those opportunities that both Nathalie and Lisa brought up. I think they could definitely be vital for you. Also, take a look at sponsorships. So I've been able to pull in, let's say about $12,000 or so from partners, because I have the ear to a population they need. So think about that example. I think the example Don gave of, tagging yourself and putting yourself in conversation with those people, that goes a long way too. That's actually how I ended up with some of my sponsors that took note of me. So I just wanted to say that as well.
Dr. Knobloch, can I pose a question?
Yes, please, Doctor. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my question, although I'm directing it to Ariel, Nathalie, and Lisa, I think it would be, it's probably good for those at other institutions as well. And the question is, how supportive is Purdue when it comes to pursuing entrepreneurial activities? And relatedly, should students have concerns about ownership of their intellectual property? So where wants to start?
So, I mean, if you're working in a lab and you're funded by Purdue to do research, and the venture has anything to do with that research, then there are implications for intellectual property. But if if it's separate from your research, and I know sometimes, something that you're spending 40 hours or more a week on, your expertise is probably in that area as well. But if it's separate from that job that you're paid for, then it's your intellectual property. But I always encourage people, instead of avoiding and living in some gray area, if you have questions about that, go talk to the Office of Technology Commercialization so that you don't end up with a problem. And so you get it all cleared up at the beginning. But yeah, it just depends if you're getting paid for that job. And it's no different than if you work in industry. Industry is paying you to do research so the company can benefit. So, you can't be in a company and say, well, I developed that diaper. I want to make the billions of dollars that came from that diaper. So it's not a bad thing, but if you have questions about it, it's definitely something that you should get clarity on. Yeah. And I was going to say another thing about the funding. So, I've seen thousands of students go through our entrepreneurship programs over the years, and typically funding, especially if it's an idea that's not related to a, multi-million-dollar lab, typically they don't need a lot of funding. We even had a small fund for students, like a $5,000, that if they wanted to do a prototype or if they needed something, they would never come to us for that. And I have to say this, the people who really want to do it, figure out a way to do it. And sometimes you do have to spend a little money to make money. Sometimes you might have to ask, the family or friend for money. Or like Ariel said, you just go out there and start doing it. And then, eventually you get some traction and the money will come. So, the people worried about money often at times are the people that have the idea, but, you need some grit and you need some resourcefulness to kind of move it forward. So don't let money be the obstacle.
I'll say this real quick before I have to jump off. I have a meeting with my advisor. Dr. Esther, to your last point, I'll try to tie them together. I will speak from my committee. My committee has been supportive. My committee was very excited about my work. Every now and then they check in and make sure I'm not doing 50 million jobs on campus in addition to my work, but they have been very supportive. I can't say that has been the case for all students on this campus, because I am connected to many graduate students here who have been entrepreneurial in many ways. And I would be remiss to address the fact that many times for graduate students of color, that becomes even more difficult. Dr. Esther, your question also brings up something that we didn't necessarily hit. We talked about what mentors should do, but it's also what we should not be doing. And I would be remiss if I did not address what happened last summer in the very case with entrepreneurship and mentorship. For many of us, especially people of color, the hashtag Black in the Ivory trended last year, detailing the experiences of racism, sexism in the academy. And it was during a time where people couldn't turn a blind eye to it. Well, there was a graduate student that was a co-founder of that initiative. There was the grad student that got students of color to chime in and share their experiences and be vulnerable on social media. It was the graduate student that led the fundraising efforts to get that hashtag trademarked. And when the money started coming in, the professor that acknowledged multiple times prior that student was a co-founder, then removed that student and said they were simply an amplifier. That professor has gone on to publish books and conferences in that name, and that student was exploited. So I hesitate in saying words like exploitation when it comes down to entrepreneurship, because many times it carries a sting, especially for, I wouldn't say underestimated, underrepresented, we're simply underestimated populations. And I saw so many faculty, use that hashtag, but we saw that situation happen in real time. And I didn't see any faculty stand up for that student. I did see grad students stand up for her though. And I think that is important, that if you are going to be a mentor that is going to support grad students who are entrepreneurial, and I'm assuming most of you are because you're on this call, to also remember if they started with you as a co-founder, then they will be with you throughout that process, and to recognize their contributions as such. The second thing is that we have many students that are very innovative in their research. And many times we may have a professor that may want their name also included on that dissertation. Understand that that's that student's labor and that student's work. What you can do is to put your work in conversation with that scholar. So those are some of the challenges that we still have about the entrepreneurial mindset with grad students. And I really do hope that we can have further conversations on those topics as well.
Very important. Thank you, Ariel. And thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, and thank you, Ariel, for sharing that. I know you need to run. And I think with that, the mic has been dropped. A comment in the chat from Alicia is that you touched her soul, and I think you inspired all of us with that those closing remarks. So thank you. Also, thank you, Lisa, Natalie, and Don for serving on this panel, and Ariel for all the words that you've shared around this topic of personal branding and entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial activities, and developing that mindset. I know you've inspired me, and it's going to help me to think differently about how I have conversations with my students. Thank you all for joining today. I don't believe we missed anything in the chat other than just a reminder to complete the Qualtrics survey. It takes about 1 minute to give us feedback on how you, what you thought about today's topic, and then other topics we can work on in the future. So thank you all for joining us. Appreciate it. And hope you get a chance to get outside and catch some beautiful sunshine. Hopefully it's sun shining up there. Sun is shining up there, Don, in Wisconsin. Thank you all.